The Last Word, Chapter 2, Why We Can't Understand Thought from the Outside. There are four sub-chapters. I'm going to read the first one. Because of the way in which doubts about reason are raised, the issue is connected with the limits we encounter in trying to understand ourselves from the outside. Typically, in challenging an appeal to reason, not as an error of reasoning, but as a rationalization, we point out that conviction is due to some source other than argument, and there is no reason to accept something that produces a conviction in this case without justifying. In other words, we are in the mode of psychological explanation. Once we recognize the cause, we see that alternative response would be equally illegible, or perhaps superior. In offering such a diagnosis to someone else, we provide an explanation of his beliefs, attitudes, conduct, or whatever in terms that he may or may not be able to accept. If he accepts the explanation, then he may find it necessary to give up the conviction, or he may retain it, but withdraw his former interpretation of it, deciding, for example, that it's a conventional judgment that can legitimately express a particular and non-universal point of view. What we have offered him is an external view of himself, or at least of some of his judgment and attitudes. We can also apply this sort of criticism to particular regions of judgment of our own, which we have assumed to be based on reasoning, whose validity is unqualified or universal. Sometimes we may conclude that after all, that is not so. It is not unusual in this way to come to believe that some of our moral or political conviction are more personally or socially subjective in origin than we had thought. Whether or not it leads to revision of those convictions, it is an important form of self-awareness. However, the pursuit of self-awareness breaks down if we try to extend this kind of external psychological criticism of ourselves to the limit, which most often if we entertain the possibility that nothing in human thought nearly qualifies as reason in the long sense I wish to defend. We are then supposed to consider the completely general possibility, and there are contingent and local explanation of the source of all our conviction, explanation that do not provide justifications as strong as reason would provide. If there was such a thing, and the question is what kind of a thought is this? It purports to be a view of ourselves from outside as creatures subject to various psychological influence and prey to certain habits. What are we supposed to be relying on in ourselves to form that view? Suppose, to take an extreme example, we are asked to believe that our logical and mathematical and empirical reasoning manifests historically, contingent, and culturally local habits of thought that have no wider validity than that. This appears on the one hand to be a thought about how things really are, on the other hand to deny that we are capable of such thoughts. And a claim as radical and universal as that would have to be suppressed by a powerful argument, but the claim itself seems to leave us without the capacity for such arguments. Or is the judgment supposed to apply to itself? I believe that would leave us without the possibility of thinking anything at all. Claims to the effect that a type of judgment to express a local point of view are inherently objective in intent. They suggest a picture of the true source of those judgments which place them in an unconditional context. The judgment of relativity or conditionality cannot be applied to the judgment of relativity itself. To put it chemistically, the claim everything is subjective must be nonsense, for it would itself have to be either subjective or objective. It can't be objective, since in that case it would be false if true. And it can't be subjective, because then it would not rule out an objective claim, including the claim that is objectively false. There may be some subjectivists, perhaps styling themselves as pragmatists, who present subjectivism as applying even to itself. But then, it is not called for a reply. This is just a report of what the subjectivist found it agreeable to say, if he also invited us to journey. We need not forward any reason, or decline, since he has offered us no reason to accept. Objection of this kindness. You realize the shoes, but they seem to require constant repetition. Earlier footnotes once remarked the perspectivist on the appeal, which all incoherent ideas seem to have, in spite of his erroneous flirtation with subjectivism. Fortunam himself had stated very forcefully the case for the incoherence of relativism. It is usually a good strategy to ask whether general claims about truth or its meaning applies to itself. Many theories like logical positivism can be eliminated immediately by this test. The formalist point that relativism is self-refuting remains bold in spite of its formality. We cannot criticize some of our own claims of reason without employing reason at once. Some others point of the formulated. And so for those criticisms, this may result in shrinkages of domain, rationalist defensible judgment, not in its disappearance. The process of subjecting our putatively rationalist conviction to external diagnosis and criticism inevitably leaves some form of the first-order practice of reasoning in place to govern the process. The concept of subjectivity always demands an objective framework within which the subject is located and his special perspective or set of responses described. We cannot leave the standpoint of justification completely, and it drives us to seek objective grounds. It is not just that in criticizing each part of our system of beliefs, we must rely on the rest. Whatever it may be, the thoughts that enter into such a criticism must aspire to a universality that is lacking in the thoughts criticized. Some of these standards have to be discovered. Others are simply those basic and inescapable forms of reasoning enter into a forcible criticism when some example of them are among the object of criticism. A serious attempt to identify what is subjective or particular or relative and communal, and once our look leads inevitably to the objective and universal. That is, so whether the object of our scrutiny is ethnic, or science, or even logic. In the final analysis, just a fact about how we think, or can we affirm that the authority of reason is something independent, something of which is the hierarchy of our thoughts, is an appropriate reflection. I am convinced that the first alternative is unintelligible and that the second must be correct. The claim has two aspects. First, the outermost framework of all thoughts must be a conception. What is objectively the case? What is the case without subjective or relative qualification? Second, task of bringing our thought within such a framework involves a reliance on some type of thought to regulate and constrain others, which attend to general reasons, and thereby advance objectivity. This introduced a hierarchy in which reason provides regulative methods and the principles, and the perception and intuition provide reason with the initial material to work on. We constantly move from appearance to reality in this way. For example, suppose you think you see a friend who died last year crossing the street in a foreign city. Logic tells you that he can't be there if he's dead. However, the hypothesis was removed in constance. You've mistaken someone else for him. You were misinformed about his death. You have seen a ghost. The choice